The year was 1817, and England basked in the glory of post-Napoleonic triumph. London's high society had never been more resplendent, more rigidly hierarchical, or more dangerously seductive to those who dared to breach its sacred boundaries. Within the marble halls of Buckingham Palace and the grand townhouses of Mayfair, an intricate social ballet played out daily, where bloodlines determined destiny and a single misstep could mean social annihilation. Queen Charlotte, now in her 70s but still commanding absolute respect, presided over this glittering world with an iron will wrapped in silk gloves. Her court was a masterpiece of protocol, where every curtsy was measured, every word weighed, and every introduction carefully orchestrated by centuries of tradition. The Queen's weekly drawing rooms had become legendary affairs, where ambitious mothers presented their daughters like precious offerings, and where foreign dignitaries sought audiences that could alter the fate of nations. It was into this rarefied atmosphere that Lady Evangeline Montclair had supposedly arrived from the remote estates of Yorkshire, bearing letters of introduction that spoke of ancient lineage and vast holdings in the northern counties. Her story was perfectly crafted. The only surviving daughter of the late Earl of Ravenshollow, educated privately by French governesses, recently emerged from mourning for her beloved father. She possessed all the credentials necessary for acceptance into the highest circles of society. But Evangeline Montclair was not who she claimed to be. Born Victoria Ashford in the modest quarters above her father's bookshop in Bath, she had possessed from childhood an uncanny ability to observe, absorb, and perfectly replicate the mannerisms of her social betters. Her father, a learned man despite his humble station, had filled their small parlor with books on history, philosophy, and the arts, unwittingly providing his daughter with the education of a lady. Her mother, before her untimely death, had been a lady's maid to a duchess, and had taught young Victoria the intricate details of aristocratic life. When both parents perished in a fever epidemic, 18-year-old Victoria found herself alone in the world with nothing but her extraordinary intelligence, her striking beauty, and an burning ambition that refused to be constrained by the circumstances of her birth. She had studied the noble families of England with the dedication of a scholar, memorizing genealogies, learning the subtle differences in accent and manner that distinguished a duke's daughter from a baron's, practicing the graceful movements that spoke of generations of breeding. For 3 years, she had prepared. She had acquired the perfect wardrobe through carefully orchestrated connections with struggling seamstresses and debt-ridden modistes. She had practiced her signature until it flowed with aristocratic confidence. She had even arranged for false letters of credit through a network of forgers and confidence artists who operated in the shadows of London's financial district. The transformation was complete. Victoria Ashford had died in that fever epidemic alongside her parents. Lady Evangeline Montclair had been born from the ashes of that loss, rising like a phoenix with manufactured credentials and stolen nobility. Her first appearances in London society had been masterfully orchestrated. She had begun with smaller gatherings, charity events where her supposed philanthropic interests in northern orphanages could be discussed without too much scrutiny. She had cultivated friendships with lonely dowagers who remembered the old Earl of Ravenshollow fondly and were delighted to welcome his daughter into their drawing rooms. Each success had built upon the last, creating a foundation of social acceptance that seemed unshakable. Within 6 months, Lady Evangeline Montclair had become one of the most sought-after guests in London. Her beauty was undeniable, auburn hair that caught the light like burnished copper, eyes the color of emeralds that seemed to hold depths of mystery, and a figure that moved with unconscious grace through even the most crowded ballroom. But beyond her physical charms, she possessed something far more valuable, the ability to make everyone she met feel as though they were the most fascinating person in the room. Her conversations revealed a sharp intelligence tempered by appropriate feminine deference. She could discuss poetry with the intellectual ladies, fashion with the style-conscious, and politics with the gentlemen, always careful never to overstep the boundaries of what was considered proper for a lady of her supposed station. She had an uncanny ability to remember details about people's lives, their children's accomplishments, their favorite charitable causes, their particular interests in art or literature. The gentlemen of society found her enchanting. Unlike the empty-headed debutantes who giggled behind fans and spoke only of ribbons and reticules, Lady Evangeline could engage in substantive conversation while maintaining an air of refined femininity that made even the most confirmed bachelors consider the possibilities of matrimony. She had received no fewer than 7 proposals of marriage in her first season, each from increasingly prestigious suitors. But Evangeline had her sights set higher than merely a good marriage. She wanted access to the very pinnacle of English society, the royal court itself. And for that, she would need an introduction to Queen Charlotte herself. The opportunity had come through the Duchess of Marlborough, a formidable woman who had taken a particular liking to the supposed orphan countess. The Duchess had mentioned, almost casually, that Queen Charlotte was planning a grand gala to celebrate the anniversary of the Battle of Waterloo. It would be the social event of the season, with royalty from across Europe in attendance. "My dear Evangeline," the Duchess had said over tea in her magnificent drawing-room, "I believe Her Majesty would find you quite refreshing. So many of the young ladies at court these days are rather insipid. You have substance, my dear. Breeding shows, as my dear mother always said." The irony of that statement had not been lost on Evangeline, but she had merely smiled and expressed her deep honor at the possibility of such an introduction. The weeks leading up to the royal gala had been a whirlwind of preparation and increasingly dangerous deceptions. Evangeline found herself walking an ever-narrowing tightrope, where each social triumph brought her closer to her ultimate goal while simultaneously increasing the stakes of potential exposure. The higher she climbed in society's rigid hierarchy, the more scrutinizing became the attention paid to her background, her connections, her very existence. Her mornings began before dawn in her rented rooms in a respectable but not ostentatious boarding house in Bloomsbury. While her fellow lodgers believed her to be a widow of modest means managing her late husband's northern estates, Evangeline spent these precious private hours maintaining the elaborate fiction of her existence. Correspondence had to be answered in the precise handwriting she had developed for Lady Evangeline Montclair, letters that referenced estates she had never seen, servants she had never employed, and social connections that existed only in her meticulously crafted imagination. She had become a master of what she privately called the art of confident vagueness. When pressed for specific details about her Yorkshire properties, she would speak wistfully of dear old Ravenshollow Castle, so isolated in winter that one quite loses touch with the world. When asked about mutual acquaintances in the northern counties, she would sigh and mention how Papa was quite reclusive in his later years, preferring his books and his estate management to society. Each response contained just enough emotion and just enough plausible detail to satisfy curiosity without providing information that could be easily verified. Her afternoons were dedicated to the elaborate social rituals that defined a lady of quality. She made the rounds of morning calls, that peculiar English custom where ladies visited each other between the hours of 2 and 5 in the afternoon, drinking tea and exchanging the currency of gossip that kept society's wheels turning. These calls required not only perfect manners and appropriate conversation, but also an intricate knowledge of who was currently in favor and who had fallen from grace, who could be approached and who must be avoided, who held real power behind their facade of decorative femininity. During these calls, Evangeline had begun to encounter whispers of concern about the war's aftermath and its effect on England's social structure. The victory at Waterloo had brought glory, but it had also brought change. New fortunes were being made in trade and industry, challenging the old certainties of landed wealth. Foreign influences were creeping into English society as diplomats and refugees sought new homes. There was an underlying current of anxiety beneath the glittering surface of post-war celebration. More troubling for Evangeline's purposes were the occasional mentions of investigations into fraudulent claims of nobility. The war had created opportunities for social manipulation that the authorities were beginning to address with increasing seriousness. She had heard whispered stories of pretenders exposed and prosecuted, their disgrace serving as cautionary tales for anyone who might be tempted to similar deceptions. But these warnings only strengthened Evangeline's resolve. She had come too far and invested too much to retreat now. Besides, she told herself, her deception harmed no one. She had never swindled money or property from her victims. She had never broken promises of marriage or affection. She had simply taken a place in society that birth had denied her, using her own wit and charm to earn what others received through accident of bloodline. Her evenings were spent in the glittering whirl of London's social season. Opera performances at the King's Theatre, where she occupied boxes borrowed from her aristocratic friends and demonstrated her refined appreciation for music and drama. Dinner parties in the grand houses of Mayfair, where she navigated the complex protocols of precedence and conversation with the skill of a natural-born aristocrat. Dancing assemblies where her grace and beauty attracted the attention of the most eligible gentlemen, even as she carefully maintained the mystery that made her so appealing. It was at one such assembly that she had first encountered Lord Sebastian Blackwood, the Duke of Thornfield. He was everything that English nobility represented at its finest, tall and commanding in bearing, possessed of classical features that spoke of Norman ancestry, and carrying himself with the unconscious authority that came from generations of unquestioned privilege. His dark hair was fashionably styled, his evening clothes were impeccably tailored, and his manner suggested both intelligence and integrity. But it was his eyes that had captured Evangeline's attention, deep blue eyes that seemed to see beyond surface appearances, that suggested a man who valued substance over style. When he had asked her to dance, she had accepted with the appropriate mixture of pleasure and reserve, but she had felt something she had not experienced since beginning her masquerade, genuine attraction untainted by calculation. Their first dance had been a minuet, that most formal and elaborate of ballroom performances. As they moved through the intricate steps, Sebastian had surprised her with conversation that went beyond the usual social pleasantries. "You seem rather thoughtful this evening, Lady Evangeline," he had observed as they joined hands for a turn. "Are you perhaps finding London society less stimulating than expected?" "Not less stimulating, Your Grace," she had replied carefully. "But perhaps more predictable than I had hoped. One sometimes wonders if there might be more to life than an endless round of entertainments." An interesting observation from someone so newly arrived among us. What would you prefer to find? The question had been simply asked, but Evangeline had sensed layers of meaning beneath it. Purpose, perhaps. The feeling that one's life contributes something meaningful to the world. Their conversation had continued throughout the dance and beyond, touching on subjects that few ladies were expected to discuss with authority: the condition of the poor in London's growing industrial districts, the opportunities for education that might lift people from poverty, the responsibilities that came with privilege and wealth. Sebastian had listened with an attention that seemed genuine rather than merely polite, asking questions that suggested real interest in her opinions. By the end of the evening, Evangeline had realized that she was in grave danger, not of exposure, but of developing genuine feelings for a man who could never know her true identity. Their acquaintance had deepened over the following weeks. Sebastian began to appear at events where he might encounter Lady Evangeline, and she found herself looking forward to their conversations with an eagerness that had nothing to do with social advancement. He possessed a seriousness of purpose that she found refreshing after so much exposure to the superficial concerns of fashionable society. During a garden party at Lady Pemberton's estate, they had walked together through formal gardens where spring flowers created tapestries of color against carefully manicured lawns. The setting had been romantic enough to justify quiet conversation away from other guests, and Sebastian had spoken of his plans to improve conditions for the tenants on his various estates. "I've been corresponding with reformers who believe that education and improved housing could significantly better the lives of working families," he had explained as they paused beside a fountain where stone cherubs poured water into a lily-filled pool. "My steward thinks I'm being dangerously progressive, but I cannot help feeling that our position in society carries obligations as well as privileges." Evangeline had found herself moved by his sincerity and troubled by the contrast between his noble intentions and her own deceptive existence. "Your tenants are fortunate to have a landlord who considers their welfare," she had managed to reply. "I hope to do more than merely consider it. I plan to establish schools and improve housing on my estates. Perhaps even create opportunities for advancement based on merit rather than birth. He had paused, studying her face with those perceptive blue eyes. "I suspect you might understand such ambitions better than most. There's something about you, Lady Evangeline, that suggests depths beneath the surface." The observation had sent a chill of fear through Evangeline even as it warmed her heart. Sebastian's ability to see beneath surfaces was exactly what made him so attractive and so dangerous to her carefully constructed identity. Their relationship had continued to develop with the careful propriety required by their social positions, but Evangeline had begun to realize that her feelings for Sebastian were becoming increasingly genuine and increasingly problematic. She was falling in love with a man who believed her to be someone she was not, and worse, she was falling in love with a man whose moral character made it impossible for her to imagine revealing her true identity without losing him forever. The invitation had arrived on cream-colored paper bearing the royal seal, delivered by a footman in full livery who waited while Evangeline read the formal words requesting her presence at Queen Charlotte's grand gala celebrating the 2nd anniversary of Waterloo. Her hands had trembled slightly as she held the physical proof of her ultimate social triumph, knowing that this moment represented both the pinnacle of her ambitions and potentially the instrument of her destruction. Queen Charlotte's court was legendary for its rigid adherence to protocol and its absolute intolerance for any breach of proper conduct. The Queen herself, now 73 years old, had ruled English society with an iron will for over 50 years. Her memory for faces, names, and bloodlines was considered infallible, and her ability to detect social climbers and pretenders had become the stuff of legend among the ton. Evangeline knew that she would be subjected to scrutiny unlike anything she had previously experienced. Every detail of her appearance, her manners, her conversation would be examined by experts in aristocratic behavior. One wrong word, one inappropriate gesture, one moment of uncertainty about the complex web of relationships that connected England's noble families could expose her as an impostor. Yet she could not refuse the invitation without arousing suspicion, and part of her, the part that had driven her to attempt this audacious masquerade, thrilled at the prospect of the ultimate test of her abilities. The weeks of preparation that followed tested every skill she had developed in the art of deception. Her wardrobe required careful consideration, as the gala would be attended by representatives of every major European court. She could not appear too ostentatious, which would suggest nouveau riche uncertainty, nor too modest, which would imply financial difficulties inappropriate to her supposed station. Through a combination of careful borrowing and strategic purchases, she assembled an ensemble that she believed would pass royal inspection: a gown of ivory silk with silver embroidery that caught the light without appearing vulgar, jewelry that suggested family heirlooms rather than recent acquisitions, and accessories that demonstrated refined taste without ostentation. But clothing was only the beginning of her preparations. She spent hours studying the genealogies and relationships of the families who would be present, memorizing not only names and titles but also the complex web of marriages, alliances, and historical connections that could arise in conversation. She practiced her curtsy until it achieved the perfect balance between respect and confidence, and she rehearsed responses to the types of questions that Queen Charlotte was known to ask guests. During this period of intense preparation, her relationship with Sebastian had continued to deepen in ways that both thrilled and tormented her. His invitations to drive in Hyde Park had become regular occurrences, and their conversations had evolved beyond the polite exchanges appropriate to new acquaintances. On one particularly memorable afternoon, as they drove through the park in his perfectly appointed curricle, Sebastian had surprised her by asking about her plans for the future. "I confess I'm curious, Lady Evangeline," he had said as they paused to observe the fashionable promenade of carriages and riders that filled the park each afternoon. "You've been in London for the better part of a season, and yet you seem uncommitted to the usual pursuits that occupy ladies of your station. Have you no desire to establish your own household?" The question had multiple layers of meaning, and Evangeline had felt her pulse quicken as she recognized the possible implications. "I find myself in the unusual position of having considerable freedom in my choices," she had replied carefully. "Perhaps I've grown too accustomed to independence to surrender it lightly." "Independence can be lonely," Sebastian had observed, his eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her acutely aware of the deception that lay between them. And yet dependence can be constraining. I suppose I would need to find someone whose company I valued above my solitude. And have you found such a person? The directness of the question had left Evangeline momentarily speechless. In that moment, she had wanted nothing more than to tell him the truth about her feelings, about her identity, about everything that had brought her to this elaborate masquerade. But the magnitude of her deception made honesty impossible. I believe, she had said finally, that such discoveries require time and trust. Indeed they do, Sebastian had agreed, but there had been something in his tone that suggested deeper meanings, perhaps even suspicion. Their interactions had become increasingly charged with unspoken tensions. Evangeline found herself caught between her genuine feelings for Sebastian and her terror that he might discover her true identity. She began to notice moments when his attention seemed particularly focused, when his questions probed slightly deeper than mere social interest might warrant. The situation had become even more complicated when Sebastian began to appear at events where Lady Evangeline was known to be attending, creating a pattern of encounters that seemed more than coincidental. During a musicale at Lady Thornbury's residence, he had approached her during an interval between performances. "I hope you won't think me presumptuous, Lady Evangeline, but I've been making some inquiries about Yorkshire properties. I have business interests in the northern counties, and I wondered if you might have encountered any of my associates in your management of the Ravens Hollow estates." The question had sent ice through Evangeline's veins, though she had maintained her composure through years of practice in deception. "I fear Papa left estate management largely to his steward, and since his death, I've relied heavily on solicitors in York. I have had little direct contact with other landowners in the region." "Of course. Perhaps you might know the name of your father's solicitor?" "I may have occasion to correspond with legal firms in York, and a recommendation would be valuable." Each question had been perfectly reasonable, but their accumulation suggested a level of interest that went beyond romantic attraction. Evangeline had begun to suspect that Sebastian was conducting his own investigation into her background, perhaps prompted by the same instincts that made him an effective landlord and estate manager. The possibility that Sebastian might expose her had added a new dimension of danger to her situation. If her deception were revealed by the Queen during the royal gala, it would be a public scandal that would destroy her but might be attributed to royal perceptiveness. If Sebastian were to expose her, it would suggest that her performance had been flawed enough to arouse suspicion from someone who knew her well. Yet despite the growing dangers of her situation, Evangeline found herself unable to retreat. Her feelings for Sebastian had become too strong to abandon, and her ambitions too close to fulfillment to sacrifice. She had convinced herself that if she could successfully navigate the royal gala and secure her position at court, she would find a way to manage the complications of her relationship with Sebastian. The final week before the gala had passed in a blur of final preparations and mounting anxiety. Evangeline had attended every social gathering possible, ensuring that her presence at the royal gala would seem natural rather than presumptuous. She had cultivated relationships with ladies who would be attending, so that she would not appear isolated or friendless at court. Most importantly, she had spent hours in private rehearsal, practicing not only her manners and conversation but also her responses to potential moments of crisis. She had prepared explanations for any gaps in her knowledge of Yorkshire society, responses to questions about her family history, and strategies for redirecting conversations that might lead to dangerous territory. On the morning of the gala, as she prepared for what would either be her greatest triumph or her ultimate destruction, Evangeline had allowed herself one moment of honest reflection. Looking in her mirror at the elegant stranger she had created, she wondered if the woman she had become was worth the loss of the person she had been. But such philosophical considerations were luxuries she could not afford. Lady Evangeline Montclair had received a royal invitation, and Lady Evangeline Montclair would attend the Queen's gala, whatever the consequences might be. The evening of Queen Charlotte's grand gala arrived with all the pageantry and ceremony that befitted the most important social event of the London season. Buckingham Palace had been transformed into a glittering wonderland of crystal, gold, and candlelight, with every surface polished to mirror brightness and every flower arrangement reflecting the artistic sensibilities of Europe's most refined court. Carriages lined the approach to the palace in a magnificent procession that spoke of centuries of accumulated wealth and power. Coats of arms gleamed on polished doors, liveried footmen stood at attention, and the very air seemed to shimmer with excitement and anticipation. Representatives of royal houses from across Europe had traveled to London for this celebration, creating a gathering of nobility that few would witness in their lifetimes. Evangeline arrived in a borrowed carriage, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and terror that she struggled to conceal beneath her practiced mask of aristocratic composure. She had never looked more beautiful or more convincing in her role as Lady Evangeline Montclair. Her ivory silk gown moved like liquid moonlight, the silver embroidery catching the light from the palace's myriad candles. The diamonds at her throat and ears, borrowed from a sympathetic dowager who remembered her father fondly, completed an ensemble that would have graced any royal court in Europe. But beneath her magnificent exterior, Evangeline was acutely aware that she was walking into the most dangerous situation of her life. Every person she would encounter possessed the knowledge and experience to detect her deception. Every conversation would be a potential trap. Every moment would require perfect performance without the possibility of retreat or concealment. The receiving line moved with stately precision through the palace's grand entrance hall, where portraits of monarchs gazed down from gilded frames and marble statues seemed to judge each guest's worthiness to enter the royal presence. Evangeline found herself behind the Countess of Pembroke, a woman whose family had attended every royal function for 3 generations, and ahead of a German prince whose presence reminded her that tonight's gathering extended far beyond English society. As they approached the throne room where Queen Charlotte held court, Evangeline caught sight of Sebastian in conversation with several gentlemen near one of the massive windows that overlooked the palace gardens. He looked magnificent in his court dress, every inch the duke's breeding had made him, but there was something in his posture that suggested tension rather than the relaxed confidence she had come to associate with him. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and Sebastian nodded with the formal courtesy appropriate to their public relationship. But even at that distance, Evangeline detected something in his expression that sent a chill through her carefully maintained composure. There was knowledge in his eyes, and judgment, and what might have been sadness. The receiving line continued its stately progress, and soon Evangeline found herself approaching the dais where Queen Charlotte received her guests. The Queen, despite her advanced age, remained a formidable presence, her white hair powdered and dressed in the elaborate style of an earlier era, her diamond tiara catching the light from a dozen crystal chandeliers. Her dark eyes, still sharp and penetrating despite her 73 years, seemed to look directly into the soul of each person who approached her throne. Lady Evangeline Montclair, announced the court chamberlain as Evangeline stepped forward to make her curtsy. Your Majesty, Evangeline said, sinking into the deep curtsy she had practiced countless times, her voice steady despite the thundering of her heart. Queen Charlotte studied her with the intense scrutiny that had become legendary among English society. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the Queen said nothing, her dark eyes taking in every detail of Evangeline's appearance, manner, and bearing. Lady Evangeline, the Queen said finally, her voice carrying the authority of 5 decades on the throne. We are pleased to welcome the daughter of our dear late friend, the Earl of Ravenshollow. Your father was a man of great learning and discretion. Your Majesty is too kind, Evangeline replied, maintaining her position until the Queen gestured for her to rise. Papa spoke often of your Majesty's wisdom and grace. Did he indeed? There was something in the Queen's tone that suggested layers of meaning beneath the polite exchange. We trust you are finding London society to your liking after the seclusion of Yorkshire. Indeed, Your Majesty. Though I confess the pace of London entertainments requires some adjustment after the quiet of country life. Queen Charlotte's eyes narrowed slightly, and Evangeline felt as though she were being dissected by an expert anatomist. We imagine it does. Country life can be so isolated. One loses touch with old friends and acquaintances. The comment seemed innocuous enough, but Evangeline sensed danger in the Queen's choice of words. Papa was indeed rather reclusive in his later years, Your Majesty. He preferred his books and his estates to social obligations. How very like him, the Queen murmured, but there was something in her expression that suggested she found Evangeline's responses less than completely satisfactory. We hope you will enjoy this evening's festivities, Lady Evangeline. Perhaps we shall have occasion to speak again before the evening concludes. The dismissal was clear, and Evangeline curtsied again before moving away from the throne. But as she retreated into the crowd of guests, she could feel the Queen's eyes following her progress through the room. The evening that followed was a masterpiece of royal entertainment. The palace's great ballroom had been opened for dancing, with an orchestra of 20 musicians providing accompaniment for the elaborate country dances and waltzes that were the height of fashionable amusement. The dining rooms offered a succession of delicacies prepared by the finest chefs in Europe, and the galleries displayed treasures from the royal collection that few outside the court ever had opportunity to observe. Evangeline moved through these magnificent spaces with the grace and confidence that had carried her through months of successful deception, accepting invitations to dance from eligible gentlemen, engaging in conversations that demonstrated her wit and education, and maintaining the perfect balance between accessibility and mystery that had made Lady Evangeline Montclair such a sought-after guest. But beneath her brilliant performance, she was increasingly aware of undercurrents of tension that suggested her carefully constructed world might be approaching its end. Several times during the evening, she noticed groups of ladies engaged in animated conversation that ceased when she approached. Gentlemen who had previously sought her company seemed less eager to engage her in extended conversation. Most troubling of all, Sebastian appeared to be avoiding her entirely, despite several opportunities for interaction that social convention would have made natural. The crisis came during the evening's grand promenade, when all the guests processed through the palace's staterooms in order of precedence. Evangeline found herself walking behind the Duchess of Marlborough, the woman who had first introduced her to the possibility of a royal invitation. "My dear Evangeline," the Duchess said quietly as they moved through a gallery lined with portraits of royal ancestors, "I fear I must ask you a rather delicate question." Evangeline's blood turned to ice, but she maintained her composure through sheer force of will. "Of course, Your Grace. I am always at your service. I've been hearing the most peculiar rumors this evening. Someone has suggested that there might be irregularities in your background. Nonsense, of course, but perhaps you could clarify a small matter for me." The moment Evangeline had dreaded for months had finally arrived. "I shall be happy to address any concerns, Your Grace." "Excellent. Then perhaps you could tell me the name of your father's chaplain at Ravenshollow? I've been corresponding with my cousin, the Bishop of York, about charitable works in the northern counties, and he mentioned that he had no record of a chaplain at Ravenshollow Castle in recent years." The question hit Evangeline like a physical blow. In all her careful preparation, she had never considered the need to invent a chaplain for the fictional estate. The omission was precisely the type of detail that could unravel her entire deception. "I fear Papa dispensed with a resident chaplain after my mother's death," she said carefully. "He found religious observances too painful a reminder of his loss. We relied on visiting clergy for essential services." The Duchess nodded thoughtfully, but her expression suggested that Evangeline's explanation had not entirely satisfied her concerns. "How very sad for him. And for you, my dear. Growing up without proper spiritual guidance must have been difficult." "Papa was himself deeply religious, Your Grace. He provided excellent moral instruction." "I'm sure he did." But there was something in the Duchess's tone that suggested their conversation was far from concluded. As the evening progressed, Evangeline became increasingly aware that her carefully constructed identity was under attack from multiple directions. Questions that had seemed mere social curiosity now revealed themselves as coordinated investigation. Her responses, which had satisfied casual inquiry for months, were proving inadequate under sustained scrutiny. The final blow came as the evening was drawing to its close. Sebastian appeared at her side during a lull in the dancing, his manner formal and his expression grave. "Lady Evangeline," he said, offering his arm with the courtesy that his breeding demanded even under the most trying circumstances. "Might I have the honor of escorting you to the supper room?" She accepted his offer with the appropriate degree of pleasure, but she could feel the tension radiating from him as they walked through the corridors of the palace. When they reached a relatively quiet alcove near the supper room, Sebastian stopped and turned to face her directly. "I believe," he said quietly, "that we need to have a very honest conversation." The alcove where Sebastian had drawn Evangeline aside was partially concealed by a massive marble pillar and heavy draperies, offering them a degree of privacy despite the crowds that continued to move through the palace's grand corridors. The soft illumination from nearby candelabras cast dancing shadows that seemed to reflect the uncertainty and danger of their situation. "Sebastian," Evangeline began, but he raised his hand to stop her words. "Please," he said, his voice heavy with an emotion she could not identify. "Allow me to speak first. I believe you know why I've sought this private moment with you." Evangeline's heart hammered against her ribs as she recognized the gravity in his tone. Everything in his manner suggested that her worst fears were about to be realized. Yet she maintained the composure that had carried her through months of deception. "I confess I'm uncertain what you mean," she replied, though her voice betrayed a tremor of anxiety despite her best efforts. Sebastian studied her face with those penetrating blue eyes that had first attracted her and now threatened to be her undoing. "I think you understand perfectly well. The question that now lies between us is whether you will continue this charade or whether you will finally trust me with the truth." The word charade struck Evangeline like a physical blow, confirming her worst fears while simultaneously offering an unexpected glimmer of hope. Sebastian knew about her deception, but he was speaking to her privately rather than exposing her publicly. That suggested possibilities she had not dared to consider. "I don't know what you mean by charade," she said, making one final attempt to maintain her cover. "Victoria," Sebastian said quietly, and the sound of her real name spoken in his cultured voice nearly brought her to her knees. For a moment, the elegant facade of Lady Evangeline Montclair cracked, revealing the frightened girl from Bath who had built this elaborate castle of lies to escape the circumstances of her birth. Then, with enormous effort, she reassembled her composure and met his gaze directly. "I see," she said simply. "How long have you known?" "I began to suspect something was amiss within a fortnight of our first meeting," Sebastian replied. "Your knowledge of Yorkshire society had odd gaps. Your references to estate management lacked the specific details that someone who had actually grown up on those lands would possess naturally. Your mannerisms, while perfectly aristocratic, had a studied quality that suggested conscious acquisition rather than unconscious breeding." Evangeline listened to this litany of her failures with a mixture of shame and perverse pride. "Yet you said nothing. I hoped I was wrong. I hoped that my suspicions were merely the product of an overly analytical mind." His voice softened slightly. "I hoped that the woman I was coming to care for was exactly who she claimed to be." "And when did you know with certainty?" 3 weeks ago, when I employed investigators to research the Ravens Hollow estates. There is no Ravens Hollow Castle, Victoria. There never was an Earl of Ravens Hollow. The entire identity you've created is as fictional as any novelist's creation." The admission hung between them like a sword, but still Sebastian had not moved to expose her publicly. Evangeline found herself confused by his restraint. "Why haven't you revealed this information?" she asked. "You could have exposed me at any time over the past 3 weeks." Sebastian was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on some point beyond her shoulder. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of pain that made her chest tighten with unexpected emotion. "Because despite everything, despite the lies, despite the deception, despite the complete fabrication of your identity, I find myself caring for you more deeply than I have ever cared for anyone in my life." The confession hit Evangeline with greater force than his knowledge of her true identity. In all her calculations and preparations, she had never allowed herself to fully acknowledge the possibility that Sebastian's feelings might mirror her own. "Sebastian, Let me finish," he interrupted. "I've spent 3 weeks trying to understand how someone could construct such an elaborate deception. I've investigated your background thoroughly, Victoria Ashford. I know about your parents, about your education above your father's bookshop, about the fever epidemic that left you orphaned and penniless." Evangeline felt tears threatening for the first time since the death of her parents. The careful control she had maintained for so many months was beginning to crumble under the weight of Sebastian's unexpected understanding. "I know," he continued, "that you're extraordinarily intelligent, remarkably brave, and possessed of more genuine nobility than half the people in this palace tonight who were born to their titles. Then why do you sound as though you're saying goodbye?" she whispered. Sebastian's expression grew infinitely sad. "Because regardless of my feelings for you, regardless of my admiration for what you've accomplished, I cannot overlook the fundamental dishonesty of your position. You've built our entire relationship on a foundation of lies." "Everything I've felt for you has been genuine," Evangeline protested. "Every conversation, every moment we've shared, my feelings were real, even if my identity was not." "I believe that," Sebastian said quietly. "But how can I trust that belief? How can I build a future with someone when I can never be certain which words are truth and which are performance?" The question pierced Evangeline's heart because she recognized its perfect reasonableness. She had created this situation through her own choices, and now she was faced with the consequences of her deception. "If I had told you the truth from the beginning," she began. "We would never have met," Sebastian finished. "A duke does not encounter the daughter of a bookshop owner in the course of normal social interaction. That's precisely the problem, Victoria. The society we live in makes such connections impossible through honest means. Then you understand why I felt I had no choice." "I understand your motivations completely," Sebastian replied. "That doesn't mean I can accept the methods you chose to achieve your goals." They stood in silence for several minutes, each lost in contemplation of possibilities that could never be realized. Around them, the sounds of the royal gala continued, music and laughter and conversation that seemed to belong to another world entirely. Finally, Sebastian spoke again. "I want you to know that I will not be the one to expose you. Whatever you choose to do tonight, whatever course you decide to pursue, your secret remains safe with me." "Why?" Evangeline asked. "Why would you protect someone who has deceived you so completely?" "Because despite everything, I love you," Sebastian said simply. "Both the woman you created and the woman you really are. I cannot be with you, but neither can I be the instrument of your destruction." The declaration of love, coming at the moment of their final separation, was almost more than Evangeline could bear. She reached out instinctively toward him, then stopped as she remembered where they were and who might be watching. "I love you too," she whispered. "More than I ever thought possible to love anyone." "I know," Sebastian replied. "I could see it in your eyes, even when everything else about you was fiction." "Then how can you walk away?" "Because love without trust is merely passion, and passion without honesty is ultimately destructive." His voice carried absolute conviction despite the pain she could see in his expression. "You deserve better than a relationship built on such uncertain foundations, and so do I." Before Evangeline could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps interrupted their private moment. They separated quickly, reassuming the formal postures appropriate to their supposed social relationship just as a group of ladies rounded the marble pillar. "Lady Evangeline," exclaimed the Countess of Thornbury, her voice bright with artificial enthusiasm. "We've been looking everywhere for you. Her Majesty has requested that certain guests join her in the private drawing room for intimate conversation." The invitation was phrased as an honor, but Evangeline recognized it for what it truly was, a royal summons that could not be refused or avoided. Queen Charlotte had decided the time had come for a more thorough investigation of Lady Evangeline Montclair. "Of course," Evangeline replied, her voice steady despite the chaos of emotions swirling within her. "I am honored by Her Majesty's attention." As she prepared to follow the Countess toward what would almost certainly be her final public appearance as Lady Evangeline Montclair, she glanced back at Sebastian one last time. He stood watching her departure with an expression of profound sadness and what might have been regret. Their eyes met for a moment that contained all the words they would never have the opportunity to speak, all the possibilities that would never be realized, all the love that would never find its proper expression. Then Evangeline turned away and walked toward her confrontation with Queen Charlotte, carrying herself with the dignity and grace that had defined Lady Evangeline Montclair, even as she prepared to face the destruction of everything she had built. The Queen's private drawing room was an intimate chamber by royal standards, though it would have dwarfed the parlor of most English homes. Decorated in shades of deep blue and gold, with portraits of the royal family gazing down from silk-covered walls, it served as Queen Charlotte's personal space for conversations that required discretion rather than ceremony. Only 12 guests had been invited to join the Queen for this more intimate gathering, and Evangeline recognized immediately that she was not among friends. The Duchess of Marlborough sat near the fireplace, her expression carefully neutral but her eyes watchful. Lady Pemberton occupied a chair near the window, her fingers nervously adjusting her fan. Most significantly, Lord Chancellor Eldon stood near the Queen's chair, his presence suggesting that this gathering had legal as well as social implications. Queen Charlotte herself presided from a throne-like chair upholstered in royal blue velvet, her posture erect despite her advanced age, her dark eyes alert and penetrating. She had changed from her formal court dress into a somewhat simpler gown, but her diamonds still caught the light from the room's elegant candelabras, and her presence filled the space with unmistakable authority. "Please, be seated," the Queen commanded as the selected guests arranged themselves on sofas and chairs positioned to face her chair. "We have invited you here for a conversation that we believe will prove illuminating." Evangeline chose a seat near the back of the group, hoping to remain inconspicuous, but she could feel the Queen's attention focusing on her like a magnifying glass concentrating sunlight. "Tonight's celebration has reminded us of the importance of honesty in our social fabric," Queen Charlotte began, her voice carrying easily through the quiet room. "The victory at Waterloo was achieved through courage, sacrifice, and above all, through truth. Our brave soldiers did not achieve victory through deception or false representation." Several guests murmured agreement, but Evangeline remained silent, sensing that the Queen's seemingly general observations were leading towards something far more specific. "It has come to our attention," the Queen continued, "that our society may have been infiltrated by those who seek advancement through false pretenses. Such deception represents not merely personal dishonesty, but an assault upon the very foundations of social order." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Evangeline could feel sweat beginning to form on her palms despite the coolness of the evening air. "Your Majesty speaks wisely," said Lord Chancellor Eldon, his legal training evident in his careful pronunciation. "The law takes a most serious view of fraudulent claims to nobility. Such deceptions can result in imprisonment, financial penalties, and permanent banishment from respectable society." Indeed, the Queen agreed. "Which is why we have taken the unusual step of conducting our own investigation into certain irregularities that have been brought to our attention." Queen Charlotte's gaze swept the assembled guests before settling unmistakably on Evangeline. The moment of reckoning had finally arrived. "Lady Evangeline Montclair," the Queen said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Would you be so kind as to join us here?" Every eye in the room turned toward Evangeline as she rose from her chair with as much grace as she could muster. Her legs felt unsteady, but years of practicing aristocratic deportment carried her forward until she stood directly before the Queen's chair. "Your Majesty," she said, offering a curtsy that was perfect in its execution despite the trembling in her limbs. Queen Charlotte studied her for a long moment, her dark eyes taking in every detail of Evangeline's appearance and demeanor. When she finally spoke, her voice was surprisingly gentle. "We have spent considerable effort investigating your background, my dear. Our inquiries have revealed some rather interesting discrepancies." Evangeline maintained her composure, but she could feel the elaborate structure of her deception crumbling around her. "I fear I don't understand, Your Majesty." "Don't you?" The Queen's eyebrows rose slightly. "Then perhaps you can explain why our agents could find no record of Ravenshollow Castle in any official documents. No record of an Earl of Ravenshollow in any peerage listings. No record of your father in any Yorkshire parish registers." The questions hung in the air like accusations. Around the room, Evangeline could hear the sharp intake of breath from guests who were witnessing the exposure of the season's most celebrated mystery lady. For a moment, Evangeline considered maintaining her deception to the very end. But as she looked into Queen Charlotte's knowing eyes, she realized that such stubbornness would only add foolishness to her crimes. "I cannot explain those discrepancies, Your Majesty," she said quietly, "because you already know the truth." "And what truth is that, child?" Evangeline drew herself up to her full height, determined to face her destruction with dignity. "The truth is that I am not Lady Evangeline Montclair. I am Victoria Ashford, daughter of a bookshop owner from Bath. I have spent the past year living a lie, and I stand before you prepared to accept the consequences of my deception." The admission sent a shock through the assembled guests. Lady Pemberton gasped audibly, and the Duchess of Marlborough shook her head in what might have been disappointment or amazement. But Queen Charlotte's expression remained remarkably calm. "At last," she said, "we have honesty. Now perhaps we can have a meaningful conversation." "Your Majesty." Evangeline was confused by the Queen's unexpected response. "Sit down, Miss Ashford," the Queen commanded, gesturing to a chair that had been placed directly facing her own. "We have questions for you, and we prefer our conversations to be conducted between equals, insofar as that is possible between a queen and her subjects." Evangeline sat as commanded, her mind reeling from the Queen's surprisingly civil treatment of her exposed deception. "Now then," Queen Charlotte continued, "we want you to tell us, in your own words, exactly how and why you came to assume the identity of Lady Evangeline Montclair." For the next hour, Evangeline found herself recounting the entire story of her transformation. She spoke of her parents' death, of her careful study of aristocratic society, of her meticulous preparation for the role she had chosen to play. She described the loneliness of maintaining a constant performance, the fear of discovery that had shadowed every social interaction, and the growing weight of living a lie. Throughout her recitation, Queen Charlotte listened with attention that seemed more curious than condemnatory. Occasionally she asked questions that probed deeper into Evangeline's motivations or methods, but her tone remained thoughtful rather than accusatory. "Most fascinating," the Queen said when Evangeline had finished her account. "You have demonstrated intelligence, courage, and considerable skill in your deception. You have also shown remarkable honesty in your confession once confronted with the truth. I saw no point in continuing to lie when your Majesty clearly knew the facts. Indeed. But many in your position would have attempted to maintain their deception even when faced with overwhelming evidence. Your choice to confess speaks to a character that is fundamentally honest, despite your recent actions." Evangeline was mystified by the Queen's apparent sympathy. "Your Majesty is more understanding than I had expected." Queen Charlotte smiled slightly. "We have ruled English society for over 50 years, child. In that time, we have encountered every form of social climbing, fortune hunting, and fraudulent behavior imaginable. Your case is unusual not because of your deception, but because of your motivation for it. I'm not certain I understand the distinction, Your Majesty. Most social frauds are motivated by greed, the desire to marry wealth, to gain access to fortunes, to swindle money from their victims. Your deception appears to have been motivated by something quite different, the desire to use abilities that society had denied you the opportunity to exercise legitimately. The Queen's analysis was so accurate that Evangeline felt tears threatening for the first time since her confession had begun. "You have intelligence that would grace any court in Europe," Queen Charlotte continued. "You have grace, wit, and genuine refinement that no amount of breeding can guarantee. Most remarkably, you appear to have used your false position to harm no one. You have broken hearts, perhaps, but you have stolen no fortunes and destroyed no reputations save your own." "I have still deceived everyone who showed me kindness," Evangeline protested. "I have violated the trust of people who welcomed me into their homes and their lives." "Yes," the Queen agreed. "You have. The question that now confronts us is what to do about your situation." Lord Chancellor Eldon leaned forward in his chair. "Your Majesty, the law is quite clear regarding fraudulent claims to nobility. Miss Ashford has confessed to crimes that carry serious penalties." "We are aware of the legal implications," Queen Charlotte replied sharply. "We are also aware that the law serves justice best when it is applied with wisdom rather than mere mechanical enforcement." The Queen turned her attention back to Evangeline. "Miss Ashford, what do you believe would constitute appropriate consequences for your actions?" The question surprised Evangeline, who had expected pronouncement rather than consultation. I suppose I deserve whatever punishment your Majesty deems appropriate. Imprisonment, banishment, public disgrace, I accept that my choices have led me to this moment." "Do you indeed? And what of the lives you would leave unfinished, the potential you would waste through such severe punishment?" "I don't understand, your Majesty." Queen Charlotte rose from her chair and moved to the window that overlooked the palace gardens. The moonlight illuminated her profile as she spoke, and Evangeline was struck by the weight of authority and experience that the Queen carried. "England has recently emerged victorious from a great war," the Queen said thoughtfully. "We find ourselves facing new challenges that will require new solutions. The world is changing, Miss Ashford, and perhaps our society must change with it." She turned back to face the assembled guests. "We have been considering the establishment of new educational institutions for young women of ability, regardless of their birth circumstances. We have also been contemplating the creation of positions at court for individuals whose talents might serve the realm, even if their pedigrees might not traditionally qualify them for such roles." Evangeline listened with growing amazement as the Queen outlined possibilities she had never dared to imagine. "Your case, Miss Ashford, presents us with an opportunity to address both initiatives simultaneously. You have demonstrated that intelligence and refinement are not the exclusive province of noble birth. You have also shown that our society's rigid restrictions may be preventing us from utilizing valuable talents." "What are you proposing, your Majesty?" asked the Duchess of Marlborough. "We propose to offer Miss Ashford a choice," Queen Charlotte replied. "She may accept traditional punishment for her deception, exile from society and possible imprisonment. Or she may accept a position as our private secretary and educational advisor, helping us to develop new opportunities for young women of exceptional ability." The offer was so unexpected, so generous, so far beyond anything Evangeline had hoped for, that she found herself speechless. However, the Queen continued, acceptance of such a position would require complete honesty about her background and complete commitment to using her experiences to benefit others rather than merely herself. "Your Majesty," Evangeline managed to say, "I am overwhelmed by your generosity. But I must ask, would such a position require me to remain unmarried?" Queen Charlotte's eyes sparkled with what might have been amusement. "We assume your question relates to a certain duke who has been conspicuous by his inattention to you this evening?" Evangeline blushed but nodded. "We are informed that the Duke of Thornfield has been aware of your true identity for some time, yet chose not to expose you. Such discretion suggests either remarkable loyalty or remarkable affection. Perhaps both. He told me that he could not accept a relationship built on deception." "Did he indeed? How very noble of him." The Queen's tone suggested layers of meaning. Perhaps the Duke would find a relationship built on complete honesty more acceptable. Before Evangeline could respond, the drawing-room door opened and Sebastian entered, looking magnificent but deeply troubled. He approached the Queen with appropriate ceremony, but his eyes sought Evangeline's face immediately. "Your Grace," Queen Charlotte said, "how convenient that you should arrive at this moment. We have just been discussing the remarkable case of Miss Victoria Ashford, formerly known to society as Lady Evangeline Montclair." Sebastian's gaze flickered between the Queen and Evangeline, clearly trying to assess the situation. "Your Majesty. We understand that you have been aware of Miss Ashford's true identity for some time, yet chose not to reveal it. Such discretion is commendable, though we confess ourselves curious about your motivations." Sebastian straightened his shoulders, and Evangeline recognized the expression he wore when facing difficult decisions. "Your Majesty, my motivations were entirely personal. I found myself emotionally involved in a situation that my better judgment told me to avoid. And now that Miss Ashford's identity has been revealed through other means, how do you find your emotional involvement?" The question was direct enough to make several guests shift uncomfortably in their chairs. But Sebastian met the Queen's gaze steadily. "Unchanged, Your Majesty. My feelings were never based on her supposed title or fortune. They were based on her intelligence, her courage, her fundamental character, qualities that remain constant regardless of her name or birth circumstances." Queen Charlotte nodded approvingly. "Excellent. Then you will have no objection to courting Miss Ashford openly, now that she has chosen to live honestly rather than behind a false identity." "Your Majesty." Sebastian looked confused by the suggestion. "We are offering Miss Ashford a position at court, Your Grace. She will be our private secretary and educational advisor, working to establish new opportunities for young women of exceptional ability. The position carries with it full respectability and a place in society based on merit rather than birth." Sebastian's expression transformed as he grasped the implications of the Queen's announcement. He looked at Evangeline with an expression of hope and wonder that made her heart race. "Moreover," the Queen continued, "we believe that a duke who values character over pedigree would make an excellent husband for a young woman who has demonstrated such remarkable abilities. We would view such a match with considerable favor." The room fell silent as the full meaning of the Queen's words became clear. She was not merely pardoning Evangeline's deception, she was orchestrating her redemption and elevation to a position that would make marriage to Sebastian not only possible but advantageous. "Miss Ashford," the Queen said, "do you accept our offer?" Evangeline rose from her chair, her heart pounding with emotions too complex to name. "Your Majesty, I accept with profound gratitude and complete commitment to honesty in all my future endeavors." "Excellent. And Your Grace? Do you have anything to add to this conversation?" Sebastian approached Evangeline, his eyes never leaving her face. When he spoke, his voice carried all the love and hope that their earlier conversation had suppressed. "Miss Victoria Ashford," he said, taking her hand in his, "would you do me the honor of accepting my proposal of marriage?" "Yes," Evangeline whispered, tears of joy finally spilling down her cheeks. "Yes, with all my heart." As Sebastian drew her into his arms, the assembled guests burst into applause that seemed to echo through the palace corridors. Queen Charlotte watched the embrace with satisfaction, then raised her hand for silence. "Let this evening serve as a reminder," she said, her voice carrying absolute authority, "that true nobility lies not in the circumstances of one's birth, but in the choices one makes when faced with the opportunity to serve something greater than oneself." Miss Ashford chose deception to gain what society had denied her, but when confronted with truth, she chose honesty over continued pretense. That choice, more than any pedigree, qualifies her for the position we offer and the happiness she has found. The Queen's words became the foundation for a new understanding of merit and worthiness that would influence English society for generations to come. And as Victoria Ashford, no longer needing the fictional identity of Lady Evangeline Montclair, looked into the eyes of the man she loved, she understood that her greatest deception had led not to destruction, but to the discovery of her truest self. The royal gala that had begun as the culmination of an elaborate masquerade had transformed into the beginning of an authentic life, built not on false pretenses but on the bedrock of honest love and earned respect. In Queen Charlotte's court, where tradition and protocol had ruled for half a century, change had come through the courage of a bookshop owner's daughter who had dared to dream beyond the circumstances of her birth. As the evening drew to its close and the guests prepared to depart, Victoria knew that her story would become part of London society's most treasured legends, not as a cautionary tale about the dangers of deception, but as proof that in England, under the wise rule of Queen Charlotte, true merit could find its proper recognition, and honest love could triumph over the barriers that birth and custom had erected. The false countess had been unmasked, but in that unmasking, she had discovered something far more valuable than any stolen title, the possibility of living authentically, loving honestly, and serving purposefully in a world that was finally ready to recognize worth wherever it might be found.